Hello all and welcome to episode number 18. Yes, the nearing number 20th episode of the Creative Outlet Podcast, and I am your host today, Brandon Puddle, who's been hosting since the very first episode here of this show from January of 2020. And would you believe that we're already on today being December 30th, 2021, meaning that in a matter of a few weeks, this show will have been going on for 2 years? That's pretty crazy to me. I knew that eventually I would get to this spot in my recording space, but I didn't think I would quite get to it today. Now, I suppose before I get any further, even out of this first minute here, I should address the elephant in the room for at least a portion of this audience, which is if you're watching the video podcast, you might be like, well, hold on, I'm not really watching anything because this just looks like the show logo and it's fine Eris Light ITC font. And you would be right, that is the case, and for good reason. So I am back in the good old home studio, and in fact, I do have a couple of things that you might see as I open up this fine piece of footage that I'm showing you here with at least a little cameo of me in the mirror. My home studio looks a little bit different, wouldn't you say? This room that was formerly just called my room is not entirely my room anymore. It's more so of a guest room, and so I felt like, well, I don't really have a space to put the desk tripod on at the moment, but I also felt like it would be a little bit of an inappropriate space as far as, this is still going to be my space as far as the duration of my stay here at home, but, it's not very, doesn't have a lot of gamey stuff to show off for this podcast where, a little bit on this episode, but more so in the next episode, I'll be talking a bit about some video game and other media-related topics if you can't even really see anything around that's related to that. So that's the long and short of why you video folks don't have a video feed right now. But rest assured that when I come back at the good old dormitory, should I be able to record anything, there will be some video to go with this fine audio, which I will record. But as far as today's episode is concerned, I wanted to I didn't really plan things the normal and appropriate way in which I do these things. It's still an appropriate way of doing these things. Let's be fair here. I normally plan, let's have an intro with maybe some little quick topics to discuss, and then I have 4 topics plus a conclusion to talk about. But seeing as it is December 30th, and I wanna keep these things fresh in my mind since I just a week ago ended the fall semester of 2021, I wanted to spend today talking about some lessons and reflections from this past fall, because the next episode, number 19, we're going to be starting a little tradition, I suppose, from last year, continuing it, I suppose you could say, which is I want to wrap up year 2, since this would have been our second year, and we're going to be wrapping it up as soon as I reach about what would be the equivalent of the second year of recording in the end. But that's going to be a little bit more holistic. But this episode, I want to really hone in on some of the lessons and reflections that I got from this fall 2021 semester of college, because honestly, things I feel like I learned, or at least got a lot of reflections from what I did this fall, because in some ways I would say it was one of the most productive falls that I had, or at least one of the most productive semesters that I've ever had. But I also just did a lot of stuff and got a lot of things that I feel like it would be valuable to just talk about here. And I don't know exactly how long it would take me to talk about this, but I would imagine if I leave it into the next episode that we could be looking at potentially the longest beast of an episode I've ever recorded. And I'm sure I will record an episode that is longer than the Sonic the Hedgehog special, Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza episode. But I don't intend on doing that here today. But next year, or not next year, I guess it will be next year, but next time we're gonna do some of the more full-blown reflections. I'm gonna talk about Game of the Year once more. I'm gonna talk about just do the 2021 wrap up. I haven't thought of a fun sort of title for it, like last year how it was Reflections on my first global pandemic. But I'm sure I'll think of something for that. And then I do need a couple of other topics to go in that episode as well. But those are going to be the two definite mainstays, because this year I don't have a Smash Roundup since I actually did some Creative Outlet bonuses that covered that exact content. But I think with all of that out of the way, I want to start talking about the content of this episode, number 18, proper. So let's just start by talking about, in general, how did my classes go? So this semester I took the greatest quantity of classes I've ever taken, and I think it is also technically the greatest quantity of credits that I've ever taken. I believe I took 17 credits. That sounds right. It had to be either 16 and 16 both semesters, or 17 and 15 for the second one, in order for my credit numbers just to work out properly so that I can graduate in May, which is very exciting, needless to say. And so to accomplish that, I had to take 6 classes this semester. Now, one of them was a 1-credit seminar, but, it's still a class. I still had to take some time out of my day, do some work for those. But the overall theme of this semester, outside of one class, was basically just doing all of the things that I would need to take care of to finish up my degree requirements, outside of just, hey, could you make sure you take a number of credits credits that are considered intermediate or advanced level here? That's what the spring is going to be like, and frankly, I'm very excited for that, because I think that is going to have a lot of very enjoyable classes, because it allows me to broaden my horizons outside of just all of the political sciences here. But that exact topic, political science, was what I spent most of this semester working on, outside of one class, which I will talk about. Now, I don't typically rank my classes here, but I feel like, I shouldn't say that, I do personally rank my classes, but I don't typically publicly advertise those sorts of things. But I feel like this semester was a bit of an exception, because I feel like when I got from essentially the top 2/3, like the bottom third, it really bottomed out from there. So, as far as how I would talk about my classes, my favorite class that I took this semester was Political Science 363, which is considered, I believe, an advanced level class. It's politics and literature. So, what we did for that was we essentially read a bunch of books, which that's pretty fun to get to, read some fiction in a class, rather than just talk about the ways that people thought as far as just philosophy. Because even though I would think philosophy would be considered nonfiction, it's I tend to find that sort of text to be a very dry reading. But, fiction has a certain je ne sais quoi about it that just makes it more fun to read. I'll go a little bit more in depth on this, because I do have about, what do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 7 bullet points plus a couple of sub-bullet points as far as things I want to talk about here. And one of them is going into a little bit more depth on one of the reflections that I got from that class. So I'll talk a little bit more about it there. What I would classify as my second place class is actually my one non-poli-sci class, and that was Communication Arts 355. So that's just an introduction to media production class. And I tell you, that class, it was I knew it was going to be a toss-up between 363 and then this 355 class as far as which one would be my favorite. I mean, by default, it's my my favorite comm arts class that I've taken this semester. Just, honestly, probably my favorite one that I've taken in general, although I really enjoyed 449, which was the class that I took last summer on podcasting here. But you know, there were just enough things in the class that just bugged me enough to have to bump it into second place. In fairness, I should also say that the 363 I took with the lecture was someone who lectured for the other summer class I took, which was on conservative political thought. I'm still not a conservative here, but like I said, because I believe I talked about that as well with the podcasting class, I wanted to get an idea of, I want to really understand the political thought of these people that I simply don't agree with, and see, like, you know, what sorts of people out there have good reasons to think this way. But I digress. He's not necessarily a conservative either. He tries to do a really good job of being pretty neutral. So, you know, just to put it in perspective here, he taught us from a lot of conservative thinkers in the summer, which could have said some not really great things at different points, like William F. Buckley, and how he at one point was a pretty anti-segregation, or no, what am I saying? He was a very pro-segregationist sort of guy, but then he turned into being anti-segregation as he saw how pretty terrible segregation was, but that's beside the point. But then this semester in 363, we got to watch a whole video from Cornel West, who is, you know, kind of the exact opposite sort of person to who William F. Buckley ever is or was, I would say. So, you know, pretty unbiased, I would imagine. But I'm getting a little off track here because I should talk a little bit more about 355. It was a pretty basic media production sort of class. We made 3 different films, which I will talk about a little bit more because I also want to go into a little bit more depth on this class. And in fact, that will be the next brief topic here after I just talk about how my classes in general went. Let's see, I took Poli-Sci 470. Which was just all about the First Amendment. And that class was not what I expected at all in the first place, but it still ended up ranking as what I would call my third place class. Because rather than discuss much political science or just politics, we, for almost the entire semester, read Supreme Court decisions, which I'm sure to many would sound incredibly boring, and I will readily admit that it was not exciting enough for me to want to write a gajillion pages of notes on it, but I still made a point of reading the readings themselves. And granted, part of that was also because it will be a surprise on which day of the week we would have a quiz on those readings. So I also had that nice outside incentive, just as the cherry on top, to help me with that internal, again, I think of the word here, that internal motivation. Or maybe internal motivation is not the right word, but intrinsic, maybe that's it. Intrinsic motivating factor, which is just the aspect of simply doing the task itself, which reminds me, actually, that's another reflection that I want to add to this list here that I simply forgot to write down, which is the value of intrinsic motivation. So we read just a whole ton of different decisions. We read the first portion of the class is actually learning about different judicial philosophies and the ways that various Supreme Court judges look at cases. So we looked at like originalism, this idea of moral reading, traditionalism. Those are just 3 of the branches of judicial thought, it seems like. And then we talked about the freedom of speech and how it was decided in various cases. Moving on to the freedom of religion, and we tackled both clauses separately. We did have a whole 1 class period of the freedom of the press, and I'll admit that is more what I care about. I understand, of course, the freedom of the religion is probably the more important aspect to the First Amendment than the freedom of the press is, since it's essentially just one tiny clause in the freedom of expression. So I can understand why we would spend so little time on that, but I just happen to have a little more interest in that. But that's all beside the point here. it was a good class. And again, as far as the actual topics themselves that we covered in the class, that's the third one here that I have that I want to go a little bit more in depth on. What a shocker here. The 3 classes that I want to go in depth on are the ones that I enjoyed the most. As far as what I would put in 4th place, I took a class on Latin American political thought, which is one of those. So every semester there are a few, not like seminars, but like special topic sort of classes that go on in each department. And one that a professor was trying out this semester was Latin American political thought, which interested me because, that last phrase there, that's political theory, is the area of the discipline that I find myself attracted to the most, and something that I've been wanting to get a little bit more in touch with again is my Spanish. So, I did not expect that we would read texts explicitly written in Spanish in this class, but I just thought, well, it would be nice to just, even if it's to get back in touch with some of the Spanish culture, even if it's just from, or the Hispanic, I should say, the Latin American, Spanish-speaking, and Portuguese-speaking cultures throughout the world, that would be nice. So we read from a whole variety of thinkers, and if you paid attention in that one little clip that's in this video here, I do have a couple of books that I used for that final. I had to write a final paper for this class, so I just used those about José Carlos Mariátegui, who is a very interesting sort of thinker. He's apparently a Peruvian socialist, almost a communist sort of guy. But we didn't just read lefty sort of Latin American thinkers. We read Bartolomé de las Casas, who's famous for, oh my goodness, why can't I think of it? In Defense of the Indians, I think is the exact name of the text. It's not exactly jumping out to me at the moment, but it's not like I don't have a computer in front of me where I can just look it up. In Defense of the it is In Defense of the Indians by Bartolomé de las Casas. He's from, I wouldn't quite call him classical, but we are talking about like the 1500s, 1600s here, where he's basically saying, hey, Spain, you guys went into all of these soon-to-be South American and Central American lands. It's not exactly just for you to have just taken the land from the indigenous people who lived there. We should give them their land back. What a progressive thing for someone in the 1500s to say, right? So we read a whole gamut of pieces from that. Probably my favorite text of the semester was a more modern one, Ernesto Laclau's on Populist Reason, only because it really helped me get a better concept, at least in academic language, how exactly populism works and how it's used and all that sort of stuff here. I happen to think that was very valuable to me, especially, when I see people or listen to some commentators who happen to describe themselves that way. It's just nice to have a little bit more formalized text to refer to when people are like, that stuff is silly, and that stuff is like, it doesn't make any sense, and it's incoherent, and they're just ridiculous. I can say, no, it's kind of like a sub area of thought under just all umbrellas of political thought, whether it's being leftist, right-wing, conservative, liberal, all whatever else there is there. Whatever sorts of strains of thought there are. This is just really a way of constructing a world is how we described it. And I found it really, really fascinating. I could talk about it for a little while here if I really wanted to, but I don't want to spend too much time on just one book. But, that was kind of what we read, is if someone came from Spain or Latin America in some way, whether it was from Brazil or from Peru or Chile or Argentina. I didn't have a ton of Central America in the class, but, just those sorts of parts of the world. We read generally what they thought about things, whether it was things that we thought would be really neat, or some things that were pretty questionable, like there was Jose Vasconcelos's The Cosmic Race, which was a pretty interesting sort of text. I wasn't entirely sure how to take it. I think people probably interpret that text a lot of times depending on their own intuitions regarding race with it, as far as what Vasconcelos means with his goals there. But I mean, it is still a pretty seminal piece of Latin American political thought, so no matter how one would take it, it just kind of made sense for us to read it. But that was the extent of the class. We did those readings. We'd had to write a few. There were 23 readings throughout the course of the semester, and so we had to write 15 just reading posts about it, just describing like, what did you read? What did you think was the main argument? Do you find this argument convincing? All that sort of stuff. And then we had a couple of exams and that final paper, and that was the extent of the class. Again, I enjoyed the class, but again, there's just always those few things. I didn't find it particularly amazingly impressive, but I enjoyed my time with it, and that's all that really matters, is I still had a pleasant time with the class. Now, from here on out, I feel like it kind of bottoms out, and it's unfortunate that that's the case, particularly with the next class, which was 360, the history of American political thought. So it's kind of similar to that last class, only we read all about United States of America thinkers. Mostly old school ones, of course, your founding fathers, your Abraham Lincolns, a lot of old-timey sort of people talking about the things that they believe in. Of course, we read a lot of the Federalist Papers, all that sort of stuff, basic, boring, well, I would say boring, I suppose. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder, but just texts like that. And so the problem that I had with the class, honestly, it mostly came down to the final assignment, but I'm going to put a little pin in that. Of course, a lot of the readings were pretty lengthy. So were the readings for Latin America and the First Amendment. They were pretty lengthy, but the problem, and I knew this going in, which ultimately is why I really didn't end up reading a whole lot of the readings, and yet I still got an A in the class, is that the professor, I had her before in the spring of 2020, so the semester where everything imploded, where I got to record a whole 2 or 3 episodes on campus before, right after I recorded my first episode here, and then had to essentially hovel up at home like everyone else. And my experience in her class that I took in that spring was just, she would more or less describe to us what the authors would say in their texts, only in a far more understandable way. Now, in all fairness, in that class, we were reading Plato, which is thousands of years old, and we read other sorts of texts from people that are hundreds of years old, like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, you got that translating French into English, and then it's already a couple of hundred years old, and that sort of class, plus it's 160, not 360, so it makes a little bit more sense just to kind of summarize the readings than it does to go in just, some more depth about the content itself within the readings. But knowing that, I already thought, okay, I'm going to take the first few days here and just see what does she do with the lectures here. Are they just, here is what so-and-so said in this reading, basically? Or, are we asked to go through and really and truly think about the content within the readings? Because that's going to determine whether or not actually reading the readings is a waste of my time or not. And lo and behold, it was the same sort of thing as 160. So there was not a ton of reading done for that class. And similarly to 160, we basically had 2 exams, a midterm exam and a final exam, literally the same format from when I took that class too. So that was nice in that I just kind of had a preview of here's what the exam is going to be like, only now it's on the content that we studied. And I wouldn't exactly call either exam particularly difficult. In fact, I'm fairly sure I got 94s on both. Somehow I got the exact same score on both exams, but it was just fill out 10 multiple choice questions out of a possible 15 options there. Don't fill out the ones you don't think you're going to get right. As long as you fill out 10 and you get them all right, you'll get all the points for that section. Interpret a reading passage, one of your choice, you have between two, and then answer an essay question. And, that's just pretty bog standard, normal sort of stuff. Hold on. There was one short single page paper, which that was just fine. And if anything, I actually found the one that I did for this class, 360, to be easier than the one that I wrote for her in 160, because in 160, the paper was on Plato's Republic, which again is a much harder reading because it's thousands of years old and translated from ancient Greek. Or is it ancient Roman? I'll double check here while I keep talking. But it was just a lot easier. Okay, Plato was Greek. Just like I said, ancient Greek, thousands of years old. Now it's in English. That, it's gone through the ringer between its original meaning and its current meaning. But, in this case, I had to write about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which, is much newer, actually first written in English, so it's a lot easier to understand. And fortunately, we had talked about it in our lecture before we even had to write the paper. So there didn't have to be a ton of thought in it, but I still did the optional rewrite on the paper because she allowed us for just the single page paper to essentially submit a couple of revisions to whatever comments we received on the original draft, which, I appreciate. I don't think if I had done that, and if I hadn't been in class on one day where just a bunch of people, for whatever reason, hadn't happened to not choose to show up, where she decided, well, because there's so few of you here, I'm just going to give you all an extra credit point for doing this activity, basically for showing up. I don't think I would have gotten an A in the class, but I would have still had a perfectly fine grade, but I wouldn't have had that crossing the line over into it being an actual A in the course. But the annoyances for me came with the lectures and the final paper, which was the one assignment that did not just transfer over from 160 into 360 here. So my annoyance, my first one here, is with the lectures. So I already talked about how I was not too much of a fan of how they essentially just rehash the readings. And that's because then, A, we don't really have any incentive to read the readings, and B, it doesn't feel like there's any thinking that necessarily has to happen in class. And that could be resolved if there was a discussion section, but there was not for this class, which I found kind of surprising because there was a discussion section for 360, but we still had small discussion groups that we discussed a question with at the start of class, but it was always just some sort of general question about not even really the content of the reading, but the subject of the reading. So if we talked about, say, civil disobedience, we would talk about what is civil disobedience and when do you think it is acceptable, rather than talking about, what did this author think about civil disobedience and how would you change what they're saying, or something along those lines, perhaps, something that would require us to engage with what one of the authors said in his readings. Would have required us to make sure we come to class having read. So, those are my first two little irritations. But my big irritation, and granted, she did have the foresight to upload these slides after class. I know some professors just won't do that for whatever reason, but she always went too darn fast with her talking. So what that meant was I would get through, let's say we had a 17 slide lecture. The first 2 or 3 slides were always just freebie slides because it was just oh, here's the name of the class on the first one, and here's some housekeeping and the discussion question, and then maybe a fourth one of just here are class learning objectives. So let's say if it was a 17 slide show, now we're down to 13 slides. I could maybe get through then to the equivalent of the 4th slide, which would of course in practice be the 8th slide in a 17 slide show before I would either get through like, okay, we just went through a whole slide where I didn't get anything written down because you're just going through this so darn fast, or it would just be like such a major giant piece of text that I would not be comfortable continuing to take notes on the following slide, because now I would have to figure out how to finish that last portion in my notes first, because let's keep it real here. When you're a student and you have a slideshow that you're taking lecture or notes off of, you're probably going to be mostly writing down the pieces written on the screen there, because you can remind yourself of, oh, this is what he or she was talking about at that moment. And instead of, again, really closely listening in, which that's something that I want to give credit to for 70 about, actually, is he wrote on a chalkboard. Now, I mean an actual chalkboard, not a whiteboard. We only had a chalkboard in that classroom that we were in. So, it was necessary to really truly listen in to what he was saying. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be able to get great notes. Now, again, it didn't matter so much because the quizzes were on the readings and we didn't have an exam. We only had a couple of papers to write for that class, which were fun, but I'll get into those a little bit later when I talk about 470 in more depth. What that essentially meant is now I had to wait until the set of slides from that class. So if it was on a Tuesday, I would need to hope and pray that the Tuesday slideshow would get uploaded well before Thursday's class period so I could finally finish taking down all those notes. And then in the margins, I would just write down like things that I found were important that she said. So in some ways, it was like a blessing and a curse in that, then I had a little bit more reason to take closer attention to, or pay closer attention to what she was saying and actually listen into it so that I could remind myself, oh, like this, when she has this thing on the screen, really what she's referring to is this other concept that isn't clearly conveyed in the written portion on the slideshow, or, oh, this is an interesting thing that she said that I know connects to this idea here, or, oh, this clarifies what they're talking about, or what is being said at this moment. So that was a blessing. The curse was, instead of getting all of my notes in my hour and 15-minute class period, now I have to spend however long it's going to take me to finish writing them down outside of class after the fact. But the other thing that really bugged me was this final paper. So between all of my classes in the last 2 weeks, well, I guess at this point it'll be the last 3 weeks, but I didn't have to do any writing this week because I finished all of my classes a week ago. But between the last couple of weeks, I have written a good 35 to 40 pages of writing, and that is a lot, including 10 for Poli-Sci 360. Now, that in itself is already pretty irritating. I tend to find that a good cap for papers is like 8 pages. Once you get above that, I tend to find that it gets easy to start rambling and writing about things that really aren't that necessary. I've always been a big fan of if you can say what you need to say in shorter words, because I used to be a very big writing rambler, I'll say. And obviously I'm still a bit of a speaking rambler, considering how I'm talking here right now a bit, I suppose. I just, if I can be concise, I'll be concise. And if I don't need to write more, I don't want to write more. So, and a bunch of these other classes had long papers. Latin American political thought, an 8 to 10 page paper, ended up being 9 in the end that I wrote. 470, I had to write a 10-page paper, but it was a special paper, and in my opinion, it was kind of a fun paper. 363, the literature class, 2 5-page papers between 2 different assignments. At that point, it was just 1 5-page paper because I had already written the first one a long time ago. So we had to write an abstract for this assignment first, just to get an idea of like how we would tackle the topic. And I think the problem with the assignment was that it was explained pretty poorly, because it wasn't explained in the clearest way possible. So let me give some background here. For the short paper, the 1-page paper, we were given explicit instructions that you're going to get a question and you need to answer all parts of the question. I don't remember the exact prompt about common sense, but it's just like, here are 3 questions answer them all in a page, basically, and use evidence from the text. So when you get this new prompt for this long paper, that is the thought process that I went in with. So the questions were like, what is the central tension in American political thought? What is its historical origin? And I can never for the life of me remember the third question, even though I just answered this paper, but it's more or less like, what can we do with that today? How does it still apply in some way, shape, or form? So when I went into this, of course, my thought process was then, okay, well, I have to answer these questions. Clearly, there are certain texts they're looking for me to refer to when it comes to answering this question. So I'll just talk about that. And that actually gets to what I actually find the most interesting piece that I learned from that class, which is this concept of the multiple traditions thesis. So that is just a text that basically the author says, look, people have described the United States as like a liberal democracy or as just conservative or one X, Y, or Z thing, right? But he believes, this author, that all of them are wrong because really the U.S. is a mixture of a whole bunch of traditions that all happen at the same time. But the three that are the most prevalent are liberalism, republicanism, and what he called ascriptive, I don't remember if he called it ascriptive Americanism or just ascriptive inequality, but it's just like, what is the thing that, one of the things that the U.S. was most synonymous with, or even still for one extent or another is synonymous with, which is that despite all of the ideals we uphold, we're pretty darn unequal. You had a constitution that was supposed to champion liberty and justice for all, but also, slavery, right? Also, women couldn't vote. So the idea is just that, you have your liberal faith where it's just like, we don't want really any restrictions on whatever we do. You have your Republican faith, which just says, okay, we're okay with some restriction on what we can do, but it can't be arbitrary. There have to be good reasons for why someone can't do A, B, C. I've used X, Y, Z too many times. It's going to be A, B, C from now on today. So if the third one is basically just, but we still want black people to be unequal, or we still want women to be unequal because, people were prejudiced and are still today, in many respects, prejudiced. So there would always be what I basically said the central tension was, okay, people have their primary ideology, one of these two, but they still want things to be unequal. And it comes from, there's this other text that we talked about that I can't remember the exact name of, but it was by like John Winthrop, who was one of the earliest governors of the Massachusetts colony. And he basically just talked about, look, we want to behave one way, which is essentially the liberal tradition. We want to do whatever we want, but we want to live in a society where we're just treated nicely. So a more Republican way where it's like people are restricted from doing certain things because I only want good things happening to me. And I said, that's the central tension there. We want to live in a society like Americans, or the central tension is this thesis here. It originates from this piece here that just says, we want to live one way, but we want to be in a world that lives another way. That's just a matter of our psychology. That's where it comes from. We can still use this today, and seeing that, you look at, like, there are a lot of folks who are just like, when you look at, say, more left-leaning commentators, for example, they'll be like, I don't understand how the Republicans can think blah, 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 because these things are just totally incongruent. They don't believe in A or B or C in principle and apply it across the board, which, I mean, again, I would agree with, because I tend to live in the world more of principle than of, what's a good word for it, than of, oh my goodness, like, not practicality, but just like, I mean, I live in the world of practice. I have to one extent or another, but just like, I'm not entirely utilitarian. I think that's the word. I mean, I'm not entirely utilitarian as far as I'll just violate whatever I say I believe in if there's utility in doing so. But I digress. That's the way it still applies, is, those two things can be true at the same time. It's okay. I'm sorry that it bugs people, but it has to be okay, because that's just how Americans have always been, because of this central tension. And I was told that wasn't good enough because it wasn't original. Now, granted, in the assignment it says try to make your idea more original from the the writings here, the readings that you're pulling from. But I feel like with the question we were given, we weren't really set up to necessarily go for something original. The questions were set up in such a way that it's just like you should answer them, and we were taught just to answer them. So I basically just had to sit there with the TA for like 15 minutes just being like, what do you mean when you want this to be more original here? And in that period of just sitting and talking and being confused, what I came out of it realizing was basically just apply what you're saying to some sort of subject matter. So he was like, someone's talking about this sort of thing, but they're focusing on slavery. And then I was like, oh. So let's say I just apply this to women's rights, like the women's right to vote. That's what I decided on because, well, not to be too literal here, but that is also a little bit more original considering that probably the greatest example of ascriptive inequality in the U.S. would definitely be slavery. And that was what the vast majority of the texts we read were on, was slavery. But I was just like, I want to do something different. I've written about slavery in all sorts of different papers. I want to give women's issues their due here. If only because, like I said, I wrote a lot about race last year. I want to give something else its due. I want to spread the wealth of concern, so to speak. And I mean, hey, in the end, I ended up getting a perfectly fine grade on the paper, but I'm just saying here, professors, if y'all want things to go well for your assignments, just say what you mean to say. Because what I realized in the end was, again, those questions were just bad. All she had to say here was, identify what you think is the central tension in American political thought, apply that tension to some sort of social or economic concept that we talked about this semester, and talk about how you continue to see that issue purveying. That's all she had to say. But instead, we got these really weird questions that just didn't necessarily explain what needed to be explained, on top of it just being a really long paper and not really having a proper, even really truly intrinsic incentive to want to read the readings. So the whole class itself was a mess. And then we get to my least favorite class, and this I was really, really disappointed by. It was my career seminar. So I took careers in political science. And, what I expected essentially was to get like a tiny group, like maybe there'd just be a bunch of small groups that the professor would meet with every day. Let's say we've got 5 days a week. Okay, you have a class of 40 kids. Okay, do a seminar every day with 8 kids and work with them on applying to internships and learning about that sort of stuff. That's what I expected here, right? Instead, what I got were, for the first 6 weeks of class, 2-hour-long lectures about the same sorts of things that the career services on campus already talk about. So it was like, make a 1-page resume, write a cover letter. We did some exercises which are different, which were nice to learn about. It was nice to kind of reflect on what would be some of my workplace values? What are just things that I want out of my life that I need to take into account when I apply for a job in the future to have a career? That was nice. But in the end, we made a little, he called it an e-portfolio, so an electronic portfolio, that is just a little website about, hey, here's who I am, here's my resume, here's a sample cover letter that I would write, and here's a portfolio of a bunch of writing that I've done. And I went the extra mile and talked and put a whole tab, all the video stuff and audio stuff I've created, including the good old Creative Outlet podcast. So that's part of my resume now, as well as just a contact form. I thought that I would just get so much more out of that class than just, oh, here's the same stuff from the career service, but now we're going to apply it to you, and we might talk about it in class a little bit. Have at it. I wasn't necessarily expecting that we would basically come out of the class with an internship, but I thought we would come out of the class having applied to a handful and just assisting each other on the way. I understand having had to do those assignments that we did, and those are great assignments, and I think they would be very helpful toward applying for an internship, but it doesn't really matter if we do all that if we don't actually have time set up just to apply to them, just to do it? And granted, I understand that it's going to be like, oh, well, you're supposed to do that in your off time. Well, we've got a lot going on as is in our off time, as far as just reading and writing and assignments, and then just trying to take some time in between all that to just, decompress from what it is we're doing. So I was just disappointed by that in the end. But that is how my classes went. I cannot believe I've already gone on for 50 minutes, but you can see already why I thought it would be valuable to do this in its own separate episode, because I was certain I could go on for this long. I just didn't think it would be about one topic like that. But I think the rest from here on out are going to be a lot shorter, so that'll be helpful here. So why don't we just get into some of these like sort of mini topics proper. So going into a little bit more with 355 here, that's again my comm arts class. Something that I realized in taking that class is I have a desire to make more like proper film. And I don't necessarily mean like actual, full-length movies necessarily. I just mean video proper. Because one thing, so, I still enjoy making this podcast. Obviously, I've been recording here for 50 minutes, but I kind of lost the joy of editing when I got later, especially this past summer with editing all those gaming birthday extravaganzas, because it's very formulaic and very flat. And of course, they're long, so it just takes a long time to edit them. But this semester, I worked on 3 videos, which granted were a lot shorter, and I just had a lot more fun making them and editing them. Again, not that I don't have fun making the show. In fact, what I'm doing right now is probably the part of the show that I find the most fun, is just talking to the microphone and recording it. But the editing isn't nearly as fun because it's so one note. So let me go into a little bit more depth on the pieces that I make for this class. We started with a 1-minute PSA or commercial. We could do a music video if we wanted to, but most people did a commercial or a public service announcement sort of thing. For whatever reason, the professor called it the Move Me, because you're supposed to move in some way with the video that you make. But I just did a commercial for one of the organizations that I'm a part of, because it worked out that, hey, they'd been wanting a video for a long time. I was in a class where I had to make an ad as the first thing we did for the first major assignment. That just worked out. It was perfectly, things just went through and just conveniently like that. And so for that, we had to take like 20 unique shots. We couldn't record any dialogue. I could have put in voiceover if I wanted to. I didn't think voiceover would have been appropriate for it, even though obviously I have the technology and the know-how to do voiceover. I just didn't think it would be appropriate for this. So I took my 20 shots. I took my camera up, the cameras that we got to rent from the comm arts building up to the organization. I already had this whole video planned out with we learned how to do like audio video scripts, which was something totally foreign to me. I had never done them before, but I think they're pretty interesting. So if when I would go on to do more video sorts of things, that's probably a practice I would bring along with me alongside storyboards and all that other stuff, just to make sure that I know what things are supposed to be generally in sync. But I digress. I wrote that up. I printed it out, brought the camera and all the equipment up to our building, planned out the 20 shots, and I tried to be very candid with it. I think it's a lot better to do shots that look natural rather than make shots, especially for something like this, rather than do something that's set up, because I think it will look staged, especially when you're working with a bunch of late teens, early 20-year-olds who don't know how to act necessarily. But, I was able to get all those shots, and then the following week I edited it up, put some music behind it, slapped some graphics on the front and the end, and I had a lot of fun doing it, because it was like, I get the satisfaction now of going through and timing out shots with the music, and, just making sure, like, doing some color correction here, doing like just some advanced sort of things that I don't necessarily have the opportunity to do with the COP here, and just do some different stuff. And then the same sort of thing happened. We did a mini documentary. Now that I didn't get to do entirely how I wanted to, because that one, only the first project was done individually. The second project we did pairs, and then the third one we did a group of 3. So for that one, I just basically did all the production because my partner for the project ended up getting sick during production. So I had to record all the B-roll and record all of the, she was present for the interview, but we did a Zoom interview just because that's how it worked out for our time frames between myself and the person we interviewed. So I got the joy of like actually getting to just do more fun stuff with the camera than just plopping it down and recording myself, which again is fine. I don't mind doing that. I think it's still fun, but you know, it's just nice getting to get very intentional setups and clips and just different things like that I don't necessarily get to get with this show. And then the final project was just a narrative sort of video. So my group, there's only one piece of footage in the entire thing that was just me. So if I decide to show any other footage in this episode, it will literally just be a clip of just me from that video, because I would have to get permission from my other group members to show them off. And I just don't want to bother doing that. Since there is a clip of just me, you might get to see me talking all masked up because coronavirus, COVID-19 sorts of stuff happening still today in the world. But we just did a little procedural drama sort of thing. I originally was like, I want to do a courtroom drama sort of thing because I wanted to do some Ace Attorney style stuff. But we just ended up basically doing an interrogation scene out of... We didn't recreate, we recreated one, but it's an entirely original plot that we came up with of just, oh no, we think we're going to interrogate this person who we think is stealing goods from houses. Bum, bum, bum. A thief. So, you know, but again, that was fun because it's like, okay, I got to set up the shot. We record the same thing through 2 or 3 times, get into the editing room, time things out again to the music. Put up, actually get to use some fun effects that I don't necessarily get to use in making the Creative Outlet podcast here. But all of this is really just to say that I had a lot of fun doing that, and I'd like to do some more of that. Now, I don't want to make any crazy promises here, like I'm necessarily saying, oh, you know what, I think I'll take something that I say I would do as a topic on a podcast and just do like a video about it. I don't want to make any promises like that, especially because I don't have the time for that sort of thing right now in school. You know, it's a bit of a big thing to commit to, but I would say don't be surprised if in the future either there are some pure short films, or if I do decide to do something like that just to get those creative juices flowing a little bit more, because I did have a lot of fun doing it and I want to... or making some video, and I want to try doing some more of that at some point because it makes me happy, and I think I'm pretty good at it, or at least I hope I'm pretty good at it. That covers what I wanted to say about 355. Going into a little bit more depth on 363, again, that's politics and literature. This is pretty simple. I have a desire to just read more literature. So in that class, we read 6 books. I only ended up getting to read 5. I'm so sorry to the lecturer, but time got real short here at the end. I did not get to sit down and read the last book, and I kind of regret that. I'd love to go back and just pick up a copy and read it. But we read, technically 7. We read Antigone, which I'd already read in school before, and I really enjoyed getting to go back and read that good old Greek tragedy translated up for me, and this time it also made a lot more sense, of course, making this my second read through the play. But not only did we read that, we also read, the first book we read was Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. The lecturer for that class was a bit of a Kurt Vonnegut fan, so we read 2 of his books. Cat's Cradle, honestly, that was probably my favorite book of the semester. It was just a nice, fun read. With still a serious subject matter in the end, talking about basically a world-ending event, sort of like what atomic warfare would be like. And then we followed that up with Slaughterhouse-5, which I hear a lot of people read in high school. That was not one that I read in high school, but I hear it's a popular pick. I didn't like Slaughterhouse-5 nearly as much, even though it's supposed to be a more classic sort of novel. I mean, it was good. It was neat. It was neat. hearing or just reading a war story effectively that was also kind of sci-fi, but I wouldn't call it my favorite. But, I read through them both in their entirety. And that's huge because, just for comparison's sake, I took a literature class, like an actual English class, the prior fall in 2020. And I cannot say I read any of those books, which I do kind of regret because the books themselves did seem pretty interesting, and I want to go back and read those as well. But, it was literature and film, so of course I watched the movies and read what I needed to as far as writing papers and doing assignments and such. But I didn't actually have a reason to go and read the books in their entirety. But for this class, I did. Not only because I respected the lecture quite a bit, but also because the books themselves were interesting and we had discussions. Like the whole class period was just discussing the books as a whole group. Like we were shown questions on the screen. We talked about it. We bounced off each other, and I had a fantastic time doing it, which is why it was my favorite class. Then, so our one non-science fiction book we read was If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin, which is a story of 1960s racial justice issues, sort of, I guess. It's about, actually, it was recently turned into a film, so if you're just like, oh, I can't commit to reading a book, I guess you could watch the movie, but I'm sure the book is better. It is about this 18-year-old girl who is going to marry this young man whom she's about to have a baby with. But the fiancé, the male fiancé in this relationship, is falsely accused of raping a woman. And so, of course, he gets thrown in jail, and essentially the whole story is just about the family's journey trying to help get him acquitted. And all the struggles and the pain that goes along with that, especially in a system where, if you're black, the chances of him getting free were not nearly as good as they would have been had he been white. Just plain and simple. So that was a fascinating read. I would probably call that my second favorite of the semester. I didn't love it so much at the time, but after having read the other three books, it's either my second favorite or my third favorite. The one we read after that, honestly, was probably my least favorite, and it's so very sad for me to say it because that was 1984 by George Orwell. And I don't know how much I've talked about literature on this show, but my favorite book of all time is Animal Farm by George Orwell. So the fact that 1984 wasn't as good in my opinion is very disappointing. I wouldn't quite say I was devastated because, that's a little bit of an extreme take to say on it, but I was just like, I was really hoping this would be just so good, but it wasn't. People thought the character of Winston was super unlikable. I didn't quite see that. I thought he was a totally fine protagonist. I could understand their critiques, but really the problem that I had with 1984 is that it didn't feel like a complete plot. So just for comparison here, Animal Farm to me felt like it was a total plot. You had your opening stasis, where the animals are just like, everything sucks. The farmer is a dictator. I hate him. He's terrible. Also, spoilers, Animal Farm is an allegory for the Russian Revolution from like the early 20th century. So if you didn't know, if it sounds familiar because you know the Russian Revolution, that's why. Then they kick out the farmer. Then the pigs take over and they start making changes all the way until they basically turn into humans. And then the other animals slowly realize how bad, like, oh, things are going bad again. And then you end on, oh, things are just bad all around. In 1984, you don't have that opening stasis. It's just immediately, things are bad. It's like almost as if you open on the inciting incident because Winston immediately takes this journal home that he's going to start writing in, which is going to get him in trouble because he's not supposed to just write things, especially down with Big Brother, right? And then we go through the trials and tribulations of him trying to like take down Big Brother and meeting this girl, Julia, who he falls in love with and eventually basically being tortured into loving Big Brother. And I didn't feel like I really got a proper full story. Like it feels like it kind of starts and it never really had anything to really justify the rising action and like the climax where Winston and Julia get found out felt very abrupt, and then it just kind of ended. I mean, we learned a lot in the ending. Like, I will readily admit, that it was kind of a whoa, I didn't expect this bit to be so intense here in the end, but it kind of felt like it didn't hit all the points it needed to. It didn't feel that entirely complete, because I wanted to see a little bit more of what Winston did before he even got the journal, and I wanted to see a little bit more of what is he like now that he loves Big Brother. Like, what is this new resolution really supposed to be like for him? Because it seems like it could have some pretty stark consequences, but all we really get is he's been tortured, he loves Big Brother. Now, I guess to be fair, they basically, it is more or less suggested that he gets shot in the back of the head, so, he wouldn't have lived from that anyway. But it was just kind of disappointing for me. After that, we read Brave New World. Now, this is the one that I could put second place behind Cat's Cradle, but I just haven't fully decided. I enjoyed that, essentially apocalypse-esque novel a lot more. And if only because, again, that felt like a full plot. We saw, this is what this new world state is like for people. Here's how they do things. We have this character of Bernard here who wants things to be different. Spoilers, he really is not a very good protagonist. I liked him a lot less than I liked Winston, but that's beside the point. He goes to New Mexico, brings home a quote-unquote savage who just, believes in different things than this world state does. Chaos ensues, and the savage goes on to basically live in the world state, but just be entirely independent. That's a terrible summary of the plot. I know there were some spoilers in there. Go read the book. It's a really good book. But I just enjoyed it a lot more because I felt like I saw the entire stakes of the world here, and where 1984 felt like it was going for in the end there, just being like, we're trying to really mess with you sort of thing. Like, we're saying things here that intentionally sound like messed up and terrible and wrong. I felt like it didn't entirely earn it, whereas Brave New World more so earned it because we fully got to see, like, well, maybe I'm just liking it because it's sort of like a different type of screwing with you, so to speak. Because, in 1984, the concept is just supposed to be everybody's watched on all the time. In Brave New World, it's everybody's been conditioned to believe certain things. And maybe it's just that I find Brave New World a lot more believable because I do find it a lot more believable that it's realistic. It seems like, because people sometimes are like, man, the world's just like 1984. And I disagree. And I used to hear other people be like, no, it's a lot more like Brave New World. And I had no idea why they would say that because I had never read Brave New World. But now I know, having read the novel, like, oh yeah, no, modern day, certainly as far as politics goes, which again, very appropriate for the class that it's in, very much more like Brave New World. I'm very confident in saying that. But the last book we read, and the one that I didn't get to read so much, was Parable of the Sower, which seemed like it would end up being pretty interesting. It's another sort of like post-apocalypse sort of deal. It actually takes place in like the next few years in the mid to late 2020s. So, Octavia Butler didn't quite get right what would be the end of the world in the 2020s and when it would take place. But, she is right in being worried about climate change and that causing some destruction. It's just not going to be right at this very second. Hopefully not, knock on wood. Point is, I just hope that she's wrong, that it's going to be that soon. So, I didn't get to read it a ton. I want to read it more, and that gets to my reflection on this, which is, man, reading's fun. I want to read some more books. I'm not going to be taking any literature classes this upcoming spring, but if I had the opportunity, I would just like to sit down and actually read a book. Read some literature, read some fiction for funsies. So, I bought my, for Christmas, now that I have all these step siblings from my mother and my father remarrying, I bought my step sibling, I believe it's The Plague Court Murders, originally because she was like, I like reading some books, I'd like some books, or a book. And I was originally going to buy her. I was like, oh, maybe she would like one of the books that I read in this class. But then she gave me some more specifics on the genres, and that wouldn't work out. But The Plague Court Murders is supposed to be a murder mystery, and it's a later book in the series, but, this series of books was one of the prime inspirations for good old Phoenix, right? So I was like, okay, I try to be kind of intentional with my gifts here. I want to give something that's like pretty reflective of me, toward this person. So let me give her this book that, went toward an inspiration in something that I really value. She happened to get me this nice pop filter that I'm using here on my microphone. I didn't really talk much about the new technology I have here that I'm upgrading this episode with, but I'll talk about that with a later topic in this episode. It'll be just a little bit more relevant there. It's just not quite relevant yet, but it's almost relevant. We're getting to that topic. But that's just it. If she enjoys that book, if she enjoys The Plague Court Murders, I'll buy myself a copy. I'd love to sit down and read that myself and read some of the other books. So as far as the last class-related thing that I want to focus on, I want to talk about some things that happened in Poli Sci 470, which the two things that I want to talk about with that are just some thoughts on the law and some of the complications in the law and this idea of intrinsic motivation that I mentioned earlier. So as far as I don't really have thoughts on the law itself. I mean, that's what I'm going to talk about, I guess, with complications in the law, but really the first thing I want to open with in talking about it is people suggested something to me. Like, there were a good, few people who talked to me about this over the course of the class. And it is that people seem to think that I would make a good lawyer, which I think is kind of funny considering, one of my favorite sorts of game series involves lawyers. I thought I respected their opinion, and I'm not, I would be open to doing that sort of thing, honestly. I'm just not prepared to, if I would want to go to law school, immediately going to law school out of finishing my bachelor's degree, because my understanding is it's a lot of reading, and I already don't like the extent of reading that I'm doing for what I am doing, so I want to take some time off from doing just a ton of reading all the time. Plus, apparently one of the things I learned from the TA in that class is that law schools, they also tend to like candidates who have some experience in careers before they decide to go to law school. It does make you a little bit more of a desirable candidate. So if I do decide to go pursue that, I want to take some time to get some workplace experience before I do that. But I thought it was fascinating that people think I would apparently make a good lawyer. So I'm just saying, if in the next 5 to 10 years I declare I'm going to law school, you've had your warning here that may be happening. But as far as complications in the law itself, of course, I only really have reflections regarding First Amendment case law. And, it was just really fascinating getting to open the can of worms of the difference between things that are moral and ethical and what you'd consider right decisions in that realm and what are the correct legal decisions. I think this is something people generally think about, but they don't really just deeply, really and truly, and not really grasp, but grapple with what happens in those sorts of scenarios. I look at cases, of course, when we talk about First Amendment case law, we look at things like, when the Nazis wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, which was a predominantly Jewish town, and the ACLU defended their right to do that because that's case law says they can. Maybe it's not necessarily the most ethical thing for them to do. In fact, I would condemn them for doing that, but they have a legal right to do that. I look at things like, we looked at this idea of, oh my goodness, what is the exact terminology of it? I think it's expressive association, where you're essentially expressing an idea by allowing and not allowing certain people into your group. So if you have a super Catholic school or something, they can deny people who apply there if they're non-ultra Catholic through the use of something like an an honor statement or some sort of like ethics code that they have to sign and abide by because they want to expressively associate with people whom share their values. Now, again, I don't think that sort of thing is necessarily a good thing to have. It's not something that I think really makes sense, but legally it's something that people are allowed to do. What else? Well, we talked a lot about campaign finance. Say we talked a lot. We spent like a class period and a half on it because, Citizens United and Buckley versus Vallejo, just, only just some things that I'm super passionately knowledgeable about, or at least I would like to think I am. I could probably stand to study those issues even more. But that's a great example of something where legally, the money is considered equal to speech. Ethically and morally, there's no reason, as far as I'm concerned, why it should be. But, that just is what it is, whether I like it or not. And I will have to deal with that frustration until there's something like a constitutional amendment which overturns Buckley and Citizens United and all that sort of stuff. Because we have a lot of corruption issues in the United States because of those court decisions, but I digress. But I just thought those sorts of things were fun, and we got to grapple with those in the assignments that we did as well. We had to write like a 5-page Supreme Court memo. Now, we never read any memos, but we just essentially had to advise, pretend we were advising for a judge of a certain ideology and giving them an idea of like, hey, based on these sorts of cases, I think you should rule in this way. So kind of connecting to that first part, I think that was one of the things that got the TA to be like, wow, you're like, you're pretty, you do really good at giving a judgment on both sides of a coin here and giving a good rationale for why one decision should be made over another. And then our final piece was also a 10-page paper, but in this case, it was an actual decision. We got to play judge and make a decision regarding a fake First Amendment case, and that was incredibly fun. So, I just, again, all I'm saying is, if I decide to pursue law in the next few years, you have your warning. But let's talk a little bit about intrinsic motivation here. Now, why on earth am I talking about intrinsic motivation in connection with this class? So, in my discussion section here, there were a few incidents that kind of bugged me. Now, I get this, the kids mean well, and I can't act as if I am, not self-interested ever at any points, but my goodness. If there's one thing that I realized really bugs me this semester, and it's like when people are just entirely grade motivated, and just in general, it bugs me when people are entirely outcome motivated. Again, self-interest. Obviously, I care about the outcomes of how things go. I want a good grade. I want to do good work so that I make a good amount of money. I care about all that stuff, but I just cannot stand it when the things that people are worried about are just, am I going to be able to get an A on this assignment? I don't, the TA or the grader or whoever is grading your paper more so cares about your ability to understand the concepts. And if you can sufficiently show that you understand the concepts, you're gonna be fine. I understand, and again, I think back to this past spring when I took Poli-Sci 270, Understanding Political Numbers, and how much I despised that class and didn't really get much out of it. I don't feel like I deserve the A because I didn't really have much intrinsic motivation, and I don't feel like I fully demonstrated the knowledge that I was supposed to have with it. But if I was entirely focused on the outcomes, and again, not like the outcome doesn't matter, I would just be like, okay, cool, I got the A, it's over with, I don't ever have to worry about it again, it's done. And I just, it still kind of eats at me that it's just like, oh, I didn't earn that necessarily because I could have done better. And I wish people thought a little bit more that way. But that's just something that bugs me that I just found happening a few times in that class. Again, the kids who think like that, they mean well. I understand where they're coming from. In the judicial decision was originally due at the start of class on the last day of class. One of the day before that one, in or at least the prior lecture, the professor just like, does anyone have any questions or comments about the final paper, what it's due? And the only person who raised her hand was like, can we just have it due at 11:59? Which I should say, in principle, I agree with. I don't think there's really any reason to have, when you're not turning a paper in, like, physically on paper, there's no reason to have it due at the start of class. And he was just like, basically put on the spot to say, yeah, I can do that. So, again, self-interest tells me I'm very happy about that. It was very helpful to have those few extra hours just to polish up what I had written, but I just wish people focused a little bit more on the process. That's all I'm saying here. But that's all I have to say about classes. From here on out, I have more, not so much social things, but just non-class things that happened that I want to reflect on. Some of it's going to be social. So I want to talk a little bit about making mid-semester podcasts first. So, of course, I made a couple of those Creative Outlet bonuses based on just things that were announced over the course of the semester. There was our bigger direct, and then there was the and Sora, and the last Animal Crossing New Horizons update direct that happened. And I tell you, I was really proud of just being able to make some of those things. It was just really nice being able to make something, even if it didn't, require just a whole ton of effort, and just put it out. It felt, I feel accomplished from having done that. And I don't know what exactly I'm going to be able to do this spring, because, part of the beauty of the fall here was having the Creative Outlet Gaming Birthday Extravaganza with those episodes coming out every 2 weeks to just have something continuous, even if it didn't really do anything that was like useful necessarily toward just, let me grow the audience here, because that's going to come down more to simply advertising my own work. But it was just nice to have that level of, I'm putting things out. But I don't have that for the spring, because I would only have a month to put together another 7 episodes, and I'm focused right now on doing this one and doing at least wrapping up year 2. So I'm just hoping there's going to be some big news over the course of the semester where I can justify making something, even if it is incredibly lightly edited like I did for this. But if anything, I'm just proud because I actually started a second podcast for the same organization which I made the PSA for. So I'm part of my school's speech and debate organization. I'm not going to link to all the stuff here, because I do like to keep things a little under wraps. I like to keep things a little private, and so I'm gonna respect that. But I have been hosting their podcast as well. Now they just do an audio only show here, because that was something that the coach is interested in seeing someone do, especially because I have this sort of media background here, and that is I would call it. I would say the editing on that I find just about as enjoyable as doing this. I get to do a little bit more editing with it, but it's just I have to sit through 3 hours of basically a conversation that I have with someone else regarding topics that will be relevant to that organization. And it's fun sitting down and having that chat. I really enjoy it. But again, I've realized production for podcasts, that's the part I like doing about it. The editing I like. I still enjoy it. I realize that I don't like it as much as editing other stuff, and that's just fine. That just is what it is. I can certainly try and find the joy in editing podcasts again, just through doing other stuff. But I've lost a little bit of that passion in podcast editing. But I'm proud to say that over the course of the fall, I was able to release between both shows. Well, I mean, let's think about it. If I really want to be literal, including the Gaming Birthday Extravaganza episodes, I would have had those 7. Because I had 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, those 7 episodes, plus 2 bonuses, plus 4 speech and debate speaking hour episodes. That's not, what am I saying? Not 9. 13 podcasts that I recorded. Well, that's not really fair. 7 of them I recorded over the summer and edited. But that's 13 that I released, and 6 of which, so just basically half, that I recorded and edited and released over the course of the fall, which is the most that I've ever done in a semester. And if I can keep that sort of pace up this semester, I will be very proud. I don't think I'll get to 13 again because, like I said, I don't have that bank of episodes that I would have had recorded for a prior just 3 months to release. But, if I can do this one, this episode 18, do episode 19 to wrap up year 2, just do a couple here and there, I'll be pleased. And then just keep doing my speaking hour episodes I actually have to do them on a routine, but they're not too much shorter than this. I mean, I'm at about an hour and a half. That tends to be how long I want those episodes to be. But they're just a little bit less editing intensive outside of just, I have to go through all the audio and raise up the audio of my second speaker because I speak so much louder than my compatriots on the show. But, it is what it is. It would be fine if, because they have at the school, because I'm using this studio actually that they have at the school, it's only able to be used for school projects, which is why I don't use it for this. So I have to use all my own stuff. Plus now I can record here, but I digress. The device we use on it mixes, even though it can have multiple microphones recording to one device, it mixes them into one track. So I can't just double click on one track here and just totally raise using the LUFS to the loudness units all on the one track and basically make it the same as mine. And it's a process. I have to go through comb through every single line and make it about as loud the same, which again is fine, but it just gets a little tedious. The last 2 things I want to talk about here, I'm going to come back to this slightly more philosophical one. I've thought about it a lot recently, but I just want to go back I want to start with this little easier one, kind of going actually back to the media class. I want to watch more TV. I want to watch more movies, which I'm sure sounds really weird because you would think that, someone young probably watches a lot of stuff. I barely watch any TV and I barely watch any movies, but I feel like with, my burgeoning interest in media production, it would behoove me to watch some more TV and some more movies. And I say this if only because, in our, in the lab sections every week for my media production class, the TA would just ask everyone, so guys, what'd you watch over the weekend? And I would always kind of be the odd one out who is basically watching nothing, which makes it a little hard to respond to that. And I feel like I could stand to just open the breadth of things that I watch. So I don't know. If I start talking a little bit more on TV and movies in the next few episodes I'll have been completing that goal. If I just continue talking mostly about the games I play, either that means I haven't been watching a lot of stuff and I'm failing at my goal, or I'm just not watching things that I really want to talk about. And I'm hoping if that happens that it's more the latter than the former. But I suppose we'll find out in the next few months here. But that's just the really brief tangent. The last semi-major topic I want to talk about here is I want to do a riff on Abigail Adams here, which now that I think about it is appropriate since I did read her correspondence with John Adams for Poli-Sci 360 this semester. And I want to tell people that they need to remember the amateurs. She famously said that wrote to John to remember the ladies when it comes to setting up a new government. And in fact, that was a piece of documentation that I used in my incredibly long and annoying paper, but I digress. What do I mean when I say remember the amateurs? First, I want to point out I'm being very intentional in choosing the word amateur for someone rather than novice or newbie or something at doing something. Because oftentimes when people hear the word amateur, they just kind of associate it with that term, with novice, that's just someone who doesn't really know a lot about doing something. But you have to remember the prefix in amateur, which is, I don't remember if it's just AMA or if it's if it has to be AMAT, but it comes from Latin basically talking about that you love something, right? That's why we say or amor, that sort of thing. And somebody is an amateur of something when it's they have a passion for doing something, but they're not a professional at it, but they enjoy doing it. And I had a couple of experiences this semester that kind of tie into this idea here that kind of bugged me. So one of the social things that I tried doing this semester was going out to the school's Super Smash Brothers Club. Because, I enjoy Smash Brothers. I enjoy playing games. That seems like a great place to meet people who enjoy doing that sort of thing. Except there's one little problem, and I did kind of expect this. A lot of the club are tournament level players, which doesn't sound bad on its face outside of just if you're like me and you're an amateur, meaning you like playing the game. I know a lot about the game, but I don't really have any passion or desire to do this sort of thing at a professional level. And the same is true of this sort of podcasting thing. I would love to do it at a professional level, but I don't have that entire breadth of knowledge yet. I hope to the more that I do this, but I'm not an audio engineer. Maybe that's what I'm saying. I'm an amateur audio engineer, but I'm a little bit more professional as far as the actual podcast, the media part of it, I would say. But that's a side point here. I went into this hoping that I could just meet people and have fun and play games, and I essentially went for the first 6 or 7 weeks, but after that I got busy and didn't really have the motivation to go anymore because A, I was busy and had writing and reading and all sorts of just work to do, but also it just ended up not being as fun as at the start because a lot of us amateurs were not showing up anymore. I would say in most people's cases, probably because simply that they were busy, but also the organization didn't entirely make it fun to go for the amateurs. So let me explain how this goes here, right? We had this large room, and it was more or less split down the middle, where it was one side of the room was all playing Ultimate, and the other side of the room was almost all playing Melee. And there was maybe one N64 station, and maybe... Actually, no, I don't think there were any Brawl stations, but of course there was this Project M or Plus or whatever all that stuff is called, the mods that are out there for Brawl being played. So I did bring my GameCube controller, but I don't play Smash with a GameCube controller. I play it with a Pro controller. So I brought that along with me to these organizations. And what these people would do is, they would bring in Switches, and like I said, set them up on one side of the room, and bring GameCubes and Wiis and set them up on the other side of the room. And so for that side of the room, they would genuinely bring in heavy CRT TVs, because that's, of course, what you're going to get the best inputs on. And then for the Ultimate side of the room, they would do the same sort of thing, but they would bring in special monitors to play the game on. And I bring this up because I remember there being one day as I got later into this that I just kind of think personifies this sort of thing. And again, kind of like the earlier thing I talked about, this person that I'm going to talk about here, he totally meant well. I understand that he was coming from, but you got to remember the amateurs. So, there was a day where it was all of the monitors were taken up, and I'll get a little bit more into why that itself was already a problem, because it should not have had to have been a problem. And so this classroom actually did have a couple of TVs in it, so it's just I just want to start a new station on one of these TVs and just play how I want to play. And he's all just are you sure you want to do that? And I'm like, yeah, why? He's like, there's all these monitors with open spots here, and they did have open spots, but again, I'm going to describe why that was still kind of problematic for me as far as I was concerned. And I was like, no, I'd really, we have another console here. There's no one using this TV. I'd just like to set up another station and just start playing on here. And he's like, all right. And again, he meant well, but not everyone is a professional player who needs a special monitor. And I guarantee that the input lag on this TV, to the extent there was any, is not so bad that a professional Smash player or a tournament level player cannot play on it just fine. Ugh, it bugged me. As much as he meant well, it really bugged me. But again, they wouldn't even have that problem if they just followed that advice of remembering the value of the more amateur Smash players. Because the way that the Ultimate side of the room was just set up was, at the start of the semester, when you just had a ton of people showing up because they were free and just wanted something fun to do, is you would have some stations that would do tournament rules, but there would also be some stations that were just, okay, we're going to get together 4 to 8 players, we're going to play Smash Brothers, maybe if we're feeling a little saucy, we'll put on the Smash meter and put items on low and just have a grand old time. But as those sorts of people stopped showing up, then it started to be all the stations were tournament rules. So if you didn't want to play just one-on-one, no items, and, just go up against someone who's got a way higher skill level than you do necessarily, then it starts to become not very fun. Or let's say, okay, we can do 4 people, but if we do 4 people, it's got to be teams of 2 and it's got to have friendly fire on, which, I mean, that is fine, I guess. It's standard in a lot of other, like, multiplayer stuff. But, if you're like me and you just want to get together 4 people to play Smash Brothers for funsies, then you're more or less SOL. That sort of group simply wasn't there. And I think, you're always going to have your people who want to try to do things professionally and try to be competitive. But the thing that keeps organizations alive are the amateurs. I hate to say it, but it is. Like Smash Brothers Ultimate, how many copies of that game are there being sold out there out in the world? Super Smash Bros. Ultimate sales. Oh my goodness, I just wrote slays. I want sales. According to November, it has sold 25.71 million copies worldwide, making it the 3rd best-selling Switch game behind Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Animal Crossing New Horizons. I guarantee that not even, probably 40%, not even, are interested in any professional level play. A lot of those people just want to play Smash Brothers for funsies. Now, it's not like they can't turn into professional level players. It's not like there will never be people who are interested in that. And I'm also not saying that professionals can't be catered to or be, like, advertised to, but just remember some both here, guys. You're not, like, the organization is probably going to keep its longevity because I'm certain there will continue to be students on campus who are just interested in playing Smash at that level, but you're going to be driving away a lot of, like, perfectly good students who might have other skills that are valuable to the group just because you want to run things or just cater a lot more to one group. And I think the same is true, and I've noticed this a bit with some media type stuff, and that kind of gets into the new technology I have here. So not only did I receive this lovely pop filter, which I hope is working out at getting rid of those plosives, but I also, for Christmas, received a blue compass and the shock mount for the Yeti, which is called the Radius. And I've been doing a little research because I'm not ready to do this yet. But I would say probably in the next, couple of years, I'm going to want to upgrade to a better microphone, like an actual XLR sort of thing. But like I said, I'm an amateur as far as audio engineering is concerned, if I could speak. I'm a little more professional when it comes to the talking part of this. That's what I like doing. But I still want to upgrade some of these pieces of technology because I think it's important to have a more professional-esque show going on here. But I've just been seeing all these things now where people are like, the Blue Yeti's terrible and it's tinny and all this stuff. And that may be true. But I've also tended to find this opinion largely among audiophiles, which I believe is something that I kind of complained about when I talked about the records earlier this year, where it's just people just don't realize the general amateur audience for that sort of thing doesn't really care so much about all the same sorts of stuff that a bunch of audiophiles do. All I'm saying in pointing this stuff out here is I've got all this nice new technology. It really wasn't super expensive necessarily, but I'm not prepared to fully upgrade to a brand new microphone that is not compatible necessarily with some of this stuff, because I want to get a little more use out of it before I get here, or before I get there, I should say. So that's all I really want to say when it comes to remembering the amateurs. That was just another thing that happened during the semester that just really got at me. That I was just people need to be conscious of this sort of thing. So, but that, I think, covers everything that I would have wanted to talk about here today in episode number 18. It's been a very productive semester. I was able to get an hour and 45 minutes out of this, which just makes me glad that I decided to make this into its own full separate episode instead of try to cram all this into half an hour in what would have been episode 18 if I made that wrapping up year 2. But I'm just going to tell you folks, that is what you have to look forward to in the next couple of weeks here when I get to sit down again, record on episode 19, wrapping up year 2. We're going to talk about Game of the Year. We're going to talk about general reflections on the rest of 2021 for myself, or well, not even just myself, more so probably the world at writ large. Maybe I'll just call it my second year of my first global pandemic. I don't know. And I'll have to ideate a couple of other topics to talk about in that. I do have one more in mind that I have planned here. But with that, I think I'm gonna end off this recording here. It was fun getting to try off these new media toys here, so to speak. It took a good like half hour to set them up, but it was fun getting to try them out. So, but I can't guarantee that I will be seen again in the next episode, but you will most certainly hear from me either on an audio platform or just hear my voice through a video if you so prefer. And of course, if you want to, be sure to do all those sorts of engagement-y sort of things. You could give some sort of like, some sort of subscription, maybe a heart, whatever your podcast platform allows. Still haven't received that first audio message, so maybe someone wants to take the plunge on that. That'd be pretty cool here. And with that, I am gonna let everyone go. This has been Brandon Pudwell of the Creative Outlet Podcast, signing out. Thank you very much for listening in.